Hi everybody, I'm Frederick and I would really like to welcome you to this course on sex and the enneagram. I think it's a unique course. I've been working on it for 4 or 5 years, so it really shows how passionate I am about the topic. In the last few years I've just been reading every single book or article that I could about sex and the enneagram. Together with Valerie Wanamaker, an American sex therapist, we carried out many focus groups with all types and instinctual stackings, and many of the people who participated in the focus groups are watching now, so I would really like to thank you, because without you we wouldn't have been able to prepare this course. And also in the last year we've been gathering quite often with a group of sex therapists and coaches who are working on this topic, so we've been exchanging views, and this has really been helping me in fine-tuning my thoughts and in conceptualizing the knowledge that I'm going to share with you. Now, I hope that by the end of this course you will have quite some new knowledge about the enneagram. I hope it's going to be an original, a refreshing new way of looking at the enneatypes. I doubt that you've ever taken a course where you looked at the enneatypes from the sexual angle. But I think that's not the most important thing here. I think what is more important is, what are you going to do with this knowledge? How are you going to apply this in your own life? Basically, we will see how the type and the instinctual stacking is distorting the way we look at sex and sexuality. So I hope that after this course you will be able to really reflect on your own beliefs and behavior, but that you'll also be a little bit more open towards your partner, that you will be able to understand him or her, and that you'll be non-judgmental, and that you will not think that there's something wrong with your partner. I also hope that you'll find lots of inspiration to have a discussion with your partner about sex, because sexual intimacy is, of course, about the sexual act, but I think that sexual communication is not less important. And I think it's this communication which is very often lacking, just because we don't know how to talk about it. So I do hope that this course is going to inspire you a little bit. And of course, I also hope for those people of you who are therapists or coaches and you're working with your clients, I hope that it will make you feel a little bit more comfortable to talk about sex. Now, during a normal training or a retreat, you would have this personal interaction with me, and I would be able to answer all your questions, which is not possible with these pre-recorded courses. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any interaction. So please, if you have any questions or comments, even if you think that something's missing, please post it on the message board or send me an email, and I'll be very happy to discuss it further with you. So why do I care about sex and the enneagram, and why do I believe that everybody who's really serious about self-development, who's really serious about doing inner work, why do I believe people should take a course like this, or any other course on sex, of course? Well, what's the purpose of inner work? It's basically to have an integrated personality, right? So what we want to do is we want to take things out of the shadow. We want to take things out of the unconscious. Because if we ignore it, if we suppress it, we'll have this fragmented self, and it's going to lead to illnesses. It's going to create neurosis. And actually this also applies to sex, because sex is part of who we are, right? I mean, it is the strongest creative energy that's around us. It's created everything. Without sex, you and I wouldn't even be here. If you don't have your sexual energy in balance, then it's very difficult to have a real transformation. So I think it's very important that we talk about it, but we don't know how to do it. And if we're looking in the self-development community, there's actually quite some hypocrisy about it, because from one side there's this idea that you need to unravel everything about yourself, you need to fully open up. But at the same time, it's like, well, let's not talk about sex. Sex is still a taboo. Basically, we feel very uncomfortable about sex. And many people have a very sex negative look. it's as if there's something bad or wrong about sex. It's as if you care a lot about sex, it means that there's something wrong with you and that you cannot develop, that you cannot be spiritual. But as we'll see, it's actually the opposite. You have to integrate the sexual aspects. Now, the enneagram community is not different than any other part of the self-development community, because also in the enneagram community, we don't like to talk about sex. I think hardly any of you have had a trainer who was openly discussing sexual aspects of the 9 enneatypes or how the instinct is influencing it. I mean, even if you look at the sexual instinct, we sometimes talk about the one-on-one instinct. It's actually a bad name, but it makes us less at unease because we don't feel comfortable talking about sex. And what really struck me actually was when a few years ago I was at the IEA conference in Oakland, and I spoke to probably 10 people who are marriage counselors or relationship therapists. And I asked them, like, how do you deal with the topic of sex? And they were all very honest, and they said, well, actually we don't know really how to deal with it, or clients may not like it, we still want to get paid. But it's actually weird, right? I mean, either sex is going to be the cause of the problem, or it's going to be a consequence of the problem, but sex is always going to be part of the equation. Now, I was actually shocked to hear this, but I actually understand them. There's a reason why we don't talk about it. I mean, first of all, especially if you're talking in religious community, for example, there's a certain narrow-mindedness about sex. And if you're going to speak too openly about the topic of sex, it's actually going to shock them and it's going to drive them away. So you're not going to engage them. On the contrary, they will just turn away from the concept of or the whole theory and the model of these enneatypes. If you shock your clients, they may not want you as a therapist anymore, or they're not going to buy your courses anymore. But there is also something else, another reason. I think that many therapists or trainers actually don't have the knowledge to really talk about sex. I think many therapists even have their own challenges. So how are you going to work with your clients if you don't grasp your own sexuality fully? So that's why I wanted to do something about it. So I believe that sex should be part of inner work. And I really hope that therapists will gain some kind of insights that are going to make it possible for them to work with their clients. Now let's go back to sex being a taboo. Sex is actually a very interesting taboo, right? Because sex is just everywhere. It's in commercials, it's in movies, you see it on TV, it's all around us. But at the same time, our society has a very, very high level of sexual repression. We don't feel at ease talking about sex. I mean, we're talking in retreats and workshops and so on, we're talking about our childhood traumas, we're talking about problems with our parents, with our kids, challenges we may face at work. But yeah, sure, the topic of sex may come up, but we don't really feel at ease talking about it. But let's face reality. It is an issue, right? Many people are not satisfied with their sex life. Cheating is the main reason for divorce. But we don't really know how to talk about that. I mean, we're afraid of it. And because when we don't understand what's happening, we're afraid, and then we get very reactive. So what do we do in cases like that? So we're going to say, for example, oh, somebody cheated, so he's bad, or there was no love in the relationship, and we're going to be very judgmental. But it's just based on the fact that we don't understand things. We're not trying to have an honest discussion. We don't show any empathy for the person who did this wrongdoing. We're not really caring about what happened. We just have our values, we have our opinion, and we're just defending those. We're not trying to understand. There's basically no empathy. So basically what I want to do is I want to change that a little bit. Why? Because sex in relationships is probably the most difficult aspect for couples. People are afraid to talk about it because they feel uncomfortable. We actually think we know a lot about sex because we have sex, but actually we don't know much about sex. So we don't really understand it. We don't know what to say. And basically, we believe that our views are universal. We believe that our approach to sex is the right one and the approach of the partner is the wrong way. But what we do is we're just ruminating. We're just thinking about it for ourselves. We're not having an open discussion about it. So basically, each side is just having his or her own thoughts, but there is no interaction. And then at the end, what we do is we say, we're just sexually incompatible. Well, that's it. But what is sexual incompatibility? And I think this is maybe the key thing that I want you to have at the end of this course. I would say that sexual incompatibility is some kind of mental construction. It's an excuse created by our ego for not being able to have a healthy and mature attitude towards sex, and for being unable to really communicate with our partner about it. As I already said, we have our type and our instinct that is distorting our approach to sex. And what we do is we actually normalize or we glorify our own distortion, and we somehow demonize the distortion of our partner. And what we should try to do is we should actually try to change this paradigm. And that's my main ambition of this course. I believe that if people see these distortions of themselves and of their partner, and they are able to communicate with each other in a non-judgmental way, but with true empathy, with true caring, true understanding of the partner, that's actually going to solve the sexual problems. And I believe that if we are able, as a couple, to sort out our most difficult issues, then I think that all the rest of the problems are just going to evaporate by themselves. So maybe let's now look a little bit at what are we going to look at in this course. I mean, sex and personality is nothing new. For thousands of years, people have been passionate about sex, and they have already created quite a few of these personality typologies about sex. For example, there is this Hindu erotic manual called the Anangaranga. And there is a correlation between the penis size and the depth of the vagina and the sexual temperament. So for example, it talks about deer women, mare women, and elephant women. So it is the depth of the vagina that is going to determine which kind of woman it is and how she's going to act in the bedroom. And for men, the length of the penis is going to determine if a man is a hare man, a bull man, or a horseman. Of course, lots of different civilizations have come up with their own classifications, but also more recently, in the 20th century, lots of scholars have looked at it. And for example, there was Lewis Terman and Catherine Cox Miles, who already wrote their first book on sex and personality in 1936. It's called Sex and Personality, Studies in Masculinity and Femininity, for those of you who are interested in reading it. But then also later, for example, Hans Ising, he came up with a book which was called Sex and Personality, and in which he looked at these 5 main personality factors. Now, all of these typologies that have been used, be it in ancient traditions or in modern science, they basically categorize behavior. They're not trying to understand what's happening, so they're not really useful. Actually, I would say that lots of these books are counterproductive, because if we're looking, quite often trees would be very interested in books like 5 minutes to orgasm every time you make love, or 7 weeks to have better sex. It's basically having a more neurotic approach to sex. The other thing is about people with a dominant sexual instinct, right? They will want to try more tantric courses or so. But the question is this actually helpful for developing their sexuality? Or is it actually going deeper into their fixation? Now, this is why the enneagram is very interesting, because we really look at the motivation of sex. Why do we believe what we believe? Why is our sexual behavior the way that it is? And of course, what we want to do is we only want to explain things. We're not here to predict. I mean, do not believe that at the end of the course you will be able to say, oh, somebody is a sexual 5, so this person is going to be like this and this in the bedroom. Not at all. That's not the purpose. The purpose is really to understand the motivations. So before we jump into the course, there's a few remarks that I would like to make. So before we start, there's still a few remarks that I would like to make. The first one is that there's not a single teacher who's fully objective. Some teachers claim to be, but you better stay away from them. Now, I try to be objective, but I am still influenced and guided by my own Ennea type and dominant instinct. I identify as a self-preservation 6. The sexual instinct is my repressed instinct, and this shows up not only in my daily life, but also in the way that I do research and the way that I am teaching in this course. So what does that mean? As a self-pres 6, I'm highly rational, pragmatic, structured, in-depth. So I'm very good at providing some conceptual thinking, but that's not the only thing. If you really want to understand sex, you really need to look at it from different angles. And as the sexual instinct is my repressed instinct, I would really advise you to also look at some courses or books that are written by people with a sexual dominant instinct. And the good thing is that actually most of the books that are out there are written by people with a dominant sexual instinct. And if you really want to go for a completely different approach than mine, if you really want to go into the other extreme, then you have to go for people who are sexual 7s, because in the past couple of years I have seen that these people really look at sex in a completely different way than I do. It's not better, it's not worse, it's just a different angle, and it's up to you to really figure out what has value for you. Now, what does this pragmatic and rational approach actually mean? The first thing is that I am going to completely de-romanticize sex. In our contemporary society, we often see sex as an expression of love. But if we're looking at the animal world, there's not much romance in sex. When animals are fornicating, there's nothing romantic about it. And also, if we actually look at the history of human sexuality, it's only in the last couple of 100 years that humans have attributed this romantic connotation to sex. Before, this was not the case. Now, I am going to de-romanticize sex in this course here, but it does not mean that you have to de-romanticize your own sex life. There is definitely a certain value to it, and indeed, sex can be an expression of love, as long as it's love and not an expression of unhealthy attachment. Now, the other thing about this pragmatic and rational approach is that I have an academic background. So the way that I teach is quite often different than the way other teachers may transfer their knowledge. I try to really present the facts. I try to present the conceptual thinking in a very non-judgmental way. I do not want to attach any emotions to it, because basically there is no right and wrong. There is no good or bad in sex. There is only causes and effect. There is only the influence of our Ennea type and dominant instinct on our sexuality. And if we're talking already about good and bad, well, there's still, let's say, the negative. You may find my course quite negative. I may not be highlighting the positive effects too much, for a very simple reason. Our ego fixation and our passion are what distorts our vision of the world. So it's not something to be super proud of. We should not glorify the way that we distort the sexual function. So again, don't expect anything overly positive in this course. Now, the second warning that I want to make is that I will be politically incorrect, I will be direct, and some people may even consider that what I'm saying is rude or arrogant. But I do it on purpose. Why? We live in a society where people have to be politically correct in order not to upset others. But political correctness is actually being dishonest to yourself. When you're politically correct, you are actually not speaking what is true to yourself. And I really believe that if we want to go for a true transformation, if we want to do our inner work, we have to call things by their name. But calling things by their name doesn't mean that there's no empathy or no compassion. On the contrary, in the past few years, I have gained massive compassion for all the people that I spoke to, because there's so much suffering in our sex lives. And I have also come to understand that when I try to be too nice, when I try to explain things in a way that's maybe a little bit too rosy, people may like hearing it, but it's not helping them. It's not creating a change. It's not leading to any transformation. It's only when I call things really by their name and I hit the nail, it's only then that a true transformation is going to happen. And of course, it can be unpleasant. Some things that I'm going to say may shock you. You may not like them, it may be painful, but let's not forget that normally transformation is always going to be painful. So when I do this, it's not because I have no compassion for you, it's actually the opposite. I really want you to get the maximum out of this course. It's a little bit like a doctor, right? If a cancer patient goes to a doctor and the doctor is not allowed to speak about the tumor, the doctor is not allowed to work with the tumor, then not much is going to happen actually. On the contrary, the patient is just going to continue and even worsen his suffering. And the last thing that I want to say is that I'm a researcher, I'm an academic, I'm not a therapist. So listening to this course is going to give you a wealth of information. You'll have lots of new concepts, lots of new ideas about sex and sexuality. But this is only going to change your life if you're really applying it. So you need to do your inner work, you need to work with your coach or your therapist. But again, I'm not qualified to do that. Of course, if you want to get my opinion, if you want to get my thoughts on something, just drop me an email and I'll be very glad to share my thoughts with you. But it also means that during this course, there's not going to be anything experiential. There is not going to be any real exercises. There is not going to be a contemplative practice or a meditation or anything like that. I fully agree that all of these practices are extremely useful and important. They're actually crucial for your transformation in the sexual realm, but I'm not going to provide them. I see my added value really in bending your cognitive mistakes about sex and sexuality. I want you to think differently about sex. It's all about the mental center. It's all about understanding and knowing. So that being said, let's jump into the first lesson.